Hello, and welcome back to Pathfinder. My name is Philip, and I'm here to talk about Pathfinder 2nd Edition. This is part of a series I'm producing covering the various deities, factions, and NPCs in the Pathfinder role-playing game and its setting, the world of Golarion. This month, here on Pathfinder, I'm finally focusing on one of the greatest aspects of fantasy role-playing: dragons. Few things in Pathfinder are as inherently cool as dragons, so this month I wanted to shine a spotlight on an overlooked aspect of draconic lore in Pathfinder: the draconic gods. While there are 9 known draconic deities within the setting, 2 in particular have received substantial coverage throughout Paizo's publication history: the father and son duo Apsu and Dahak. Today, in this special 2-deity episode, I'm covering both of these titanic gods, as well as the foundational mythology of the draconic pantheon as a whole. That said, warning, this video contains background spoilers for the Age of Ashes adventure path. I'll call out the section where those spoilers are present, so you can skip ahead, but I want to let you know that up front. To be perfectly clear, I'll not be addressing the events of Age of Ashes in this video, only some history which could spoil some of the lore which players are intended to unearth in that AP. Before that though, if you enjoy this video and want to hear more Pathfinder lore, consider subscribing or commenting below. Or, if you want to support the channel directly, check out my Patreon. Just $2 a month gets you access to all my scripts, as well as the audio files for all of my videos, all of which drop at least a week early. With that out of the way, let's move on to History and Legends. Wait, what? Oh, yeah. This time I need to cover the history of Apsu and Dahak before I start going into how their faith is practiced, or what they teach. Trust me, this is a long and complicated tale, so it's better to lay the groundwork first rather than double back. So, let's dig in. In the time before time, when the universe was shapeless, the roiling energies flowed and collected in unpredictable ways, and this randomness gave birth to Sarshalatu. Sarshalatu, the thundering song, was as boundless and infinite as the energies which had created her, and her perception stretched across all primordial existence. Imbued with tremendous power, she began to expand and order the universe, creating planets, stars, and other great works. As she did so, however, she began to wonder if she was truly the only divine being in the universe. And such was her power that even this simple act of wondering brought about a new creation. The universe coalesced into a new god, one who would bring the concept of time and thus change into creation: Apsu, the Waybringer. Sarshalatu rejoiced at her discovery. She went to Apsu, and the two were joined in a loving union. In Apsu, Sarshalatu now had a chance for greater joys, memories of love and affection, a partner to share in creation, and even the opportunity to create children and have a family. All these things were made possible because Apsu brought time, and thus change, to the universe, and Apsu's very existence defined something which was outside of Sarshalatu herself. For the first time, her infinite existence was bounded, and she was forced to accept things which were beyond her. Still, these early eons of union and love were a time of joy, and Sarshalatu's laughter echoed across all creation. She and her mate Apsu created together, forging the bones of creation in unison and harmony. Sarshalatu giving shape to existence, and Apsu bringing the capacity for growth and change. Even in this, though, there was a hint of conflict. Apsu's touch gave the gift of time, but by definition, time brought about decay and eventual destruction. Sarshalatu was forced to watch every one of her creations wither and die, and so for the first time, she came to understand loss. But her genuine love for Apsu persisted, overcoming her grief. In time, Sarshalatu laid a clutch of eggs, and from these were born her and Apsu's children. The new parents developed language so they might name and communicate with their children, and the first to hatch they named Dahak. Apsu and Sarshalatu charged the child Dahak with the protection and stewardship of creation, and so he joined his father in the act of creating. What neither parent realized was the tremendous responsibility they had placed upon their son, or the resentment which it would cultivate within his heart. Dahak was only one of many children born to Apsu and Sarshalatu. Many others hatched in the millennia which followed. Of these, the most notable was Brixori, whose stature was small and weak compared to her siblings, but whose cunning was great. Neither Apsu nor Sarshalatu realized that their children would be lesser beings, with the capacity for cruelty, and so neither had anticipated that the hatchlings would mock and shame Brixori for her perceived weakness. Of all the siblings, Dahak was the worst, and he taunted and abused her relentlessly. Unable to defend herself with claw or fang, Brixori retreated into the shadows, becoming a master of magic and scholarship. Despite his viciousness and cruelty toward his sister, Dahak was not altogether evil, at least not yet. He faithfully served in the role his parents had created for him, guiding mortals as they grew and change. In his service, however, he could sense that which his father did not, the sorrow weighing down Sarshalatu's heart, as she watched time erode all that she had created. Determined to ease her pain, Dahak chose to shirk his duties as the guide for creation. He traveled to a lesser-known corner of creation and began making the adamantine edifice, a monument to his parents, which, despite its impermanence, would for a time relieve Sarshalatu's grief. In his ambition and arrogance, however, Dahak set an impossible goal for himself, and, in spite of his good intentions, the completion of his great work only filled him with disappointment. His work was imperfect, and failed to capture the majesty of his parents. Determined to do better, Dahak destroyed his creation, and began again. But the next attempt was just as imperfect as the first, and so he began a third time. And so began a vicious cycle, with Dahak entirely abandoning his duties to toil endlessly at the adamantine edifice. With each attempt, his creation grew more and more deformed, and his frustration, self-loathing, and resentment grew. The weight of his ignored responsibilities began to build up as well, and soon the pressure was too much. Dahak became overwhelmed by his failures and lashed out, laying waste to his creation and the plane which surrounded him. The fires of his breath transformed the plane on which he'd settled, a place which would one day become hell. Apsu, hearing the dismayed cries of his beloved son, rushed to the site of his distress, for fear that some nameless horror might be threatening Dahak's life. Upon his arrival, however, he saw no threat, only a plane of existence set aflame by anger and pain. Thinking to help his son, Apsu used his own pure fire to purge Dahak's destruction, but in this he misunderstood his child's needs. Dahak, seeing his father obliterate all his work, became incensed. True, the adamantine edifice had been a failure, but it had been his failure. Hell had been his creation, and Apsu had destroyed it, because it did not conform to his views of the universe. This was the final straw, and Dahak's last thread of connection to his parents snapped. He swore vengeance upon his parents, vowing to destroy all that they had created for the sin of having forced him into a life he didn't want, and having placed upon him the terrible burden of responsibility and expectation. Consumed by his hatred, Dahak returned home and wreaked havoc upon his family, slaughtering his siblings. He killed the brothers and sisters who had hatched after him, slaughtering all but Brixori, whose small stature escaped his notice. His most twisted act of cruelty, however, was the slaughter which followed. To ensure that his parents would never forget their pain, he took up the remaining unhatched eggs and smashed them, ensuring that his unborn siblings would never come into existence. One of these he even took up and smashed upon Apsu's own forehead, as a final act of loathing against the father who was trying to intervene. This last egg contained Odolaz, a dragon god hatchling who was on the verge of existence, and who was very near to having achieved consciousness and self-awareness. After this most heinous act, Apsu finally snapped. Gone was the loving and protective father who wanted the best for his son. In his place was the Punisher, the authoritarian who would put a stop to this savagery. Apsu then brought all his might to bear against Dahak, driven by the ghosts of his dead children, to destroy this traitor once and for all. Their fight was vicious, but the child Dahak was no match for the full fury of his father. Soon, Apsu stood victorious, but as he was about to land the killing blow, Sarshalatu intervened. Looking upon the destruction wrought by her son, Sarshalatu became overwhelmed by a level of grief and loss she had never before experienced. Determined to put an end to this suffering, she cried out for Apsu to stop. Then she hid Dahak's essence in the dark corners of existence, and in the hearts of all mortal dragons. This didn't free him from Apsu's grasp, but limited the father's ability to land a killing blow against his son. In this act, Sarshalatu admonished Apsu, declaring that all dragons would forever be infused with both Apsu's own joy and goodness, as well as Dahak's rage and hatred. Then she flew from her home, letting out a song of anguish which rippled across creation. So pained was her cry that both Apsu and Dahak were shaken to their cores, and the father allowed the son to escape. Dahak fled back to hell, where he slowly recovered from his injuries, all while stewing in hatred and fury. Soon, he knew, his strength would return, and then his father would feel his wrath once again. Apsu, for his part, took up the task of raising what few of his children remained. Brixori, who had escaped Dahak due to his low opinion of her, became the draconic patron of occult secrets. Several eggs, too, had escaped Dahak's notice, and 4 draconic gods had yet to be born. The first to hatch was Gasham, upon whom Apsu bestowed the title of Architect. Gasham was appointed to be Dahak's successor, a role for which he was a poor fit, but which he attempted to fill dutifully. Within his egg, Gasham had heard the terrible calamity of Dahak's rampage, and it had filled him with trepidation about the dangers and evils of the world. He withheld his own hatching for a long time, fearful of the chaos which awaited him in the outside world. As a fully realized god, he was defined by both caution and thoughtfulness. The next to hatch was Garhaz, who would be the draconic patron of primal magic. He, too, had heard the chaos caused by Dahak, but unlike his timid brother, he took this destruction and violence to heart, and determined that force and power were the only worthwhile tools in the universe. He became a god of predation, adopting a might-makes-right mentality, and giving himself the title the Primal King. Like Dahak, he shirked the expectations of his father. Illuma emerged next, and she was so infused with magic that her form refused to contain it. It was she who sought out and rediscovered her mother Sarshalatu, who had hidden herself away in the distant corners of the universe. Though she now saw the irony in the truth that she had been the author of both her own pain and her own joy, she still found time to comfort and train the daughter who had come to her, and thus Illuma learned how to draw arcane runes and fortify her body against the magic which threatened to tear it apart. Illuma would become the draconic patron of arcane magic. Finally, Turvu was the last of the dragon gods to hatch. Turvu saw the pain and devastation of Apsu and Dahak's conflict and sought to understand. True, the gods had come to blows, but why were the gods the way that they were? What was the underlying nature of divinity? Apsu and Sarshalatu had created Turvu and their siblings, but what had created Apsu and Sarshalatu? From whence did this power flow? In attempting to answer these questions, Turvu became the draconic patron of divine magic. And, little known to anyone, there was one more dragon god who emerged from the ashes of Dahak's rebellion. In the space between existence and non-existence, a consciousness looked upon the grief of Sarshalatu and Apsu. The sharpest of their pain had been at the loss of Odalaz, who had been on the cusp of existence when its egg had been smashed upon Apsu's head. But how could something which had never existed leave such a gaping wound behind? Thus, Odalaz, draconic deity of death and impermanence, manifested itself into existence, though the extent to which its siblings or parents are aware of it remains unknown. This was the state of things for many millennia, with Apsu overseeing a largely dysfunctional and divided family, Sarshalatu grieving in isolation, and Dahak planning his revenge. This might have remained the status quo for all time, had all of creation not come under threat. Near the end of the Age of Creation, the gods came together to confront Rovagug, the rough beast, he who would bring about the end of everything. Apsu joined this fight, and was a key contributor to the victory of Sarenrae and her coalition. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, Apsu found himself face to face with Dahak. Dahak, now called the Endless Destruction, took note of his father's interest in Golarion, the cage which now contained Rovagug. Though he'd been planning to lead an assault on his father's divine realm, he now concocted a better scheme. Dahak issued a promise to Apsu. One day he would unleash untold destruction upon Golarion, laying waste to the cage. Recognizing that this would free Rovagug and doom all of creation, Apsu swore then and there to meet his son in battle on that day. This was to Dahak's satisfaction, and he reveled in the knowledge that, at a time of his choosing, he could lure his father into a climactic fight, which would end their conflict once and for all. Upon the conclusion of this meeting, both gods began to recruit dragons to their side, for this final battle would not be a duel, but an all-out war. Dragons of all kinds, from the weakest to the strongest, would be called upon to choose a side and take up arms. All would feel the pull of Apsu and Dahak, for all were infused by Sarshalatu with both joy and pain, honor and rage. Interestingly, sources conflict over the nature of Dahak's involvement in the battle with Rovagug, even after the remaster. The most recent sources, Divine Mysteries and the Draconic Codex, merely mention that Dahak approached his father after the battle, with no mention of his participation in the fighting. Some older sources claim that Dahak had chosen to imprison Rovagug with the other gods, recognizing the threat of annihilation for what it was. While the newer sources are certainly intended to take precedence, they don't actually state that Dahak didn't fight against the rough beast, so it's certainly still a possibility. Dahak's Manifestation. Warning: the following section spoils substantial background information for the Age of Ashes adventure path. I will not be discussing the events of that AP in specific, meaning actions the PCs undertake or schemes of the villains in that campaign. However, I will be discussing the actions which set up the state of the world in that AP, actions which are revealed to the PCs of that campaign as part of their research. If you plan to participate in Age of Ashes as a player, and want to go in blind, I suggest skipping ahead to the next section of the video. You've been warned. Dahak waited for thousands of years for the opportunity to attack Golarion and ignite the final war with his hated father. Finally, when the ancient Aslanti incurred the wrath of their Algolthu masters, an opportunity to gain an advantage in this final battle presented itself. When the Earthfall meteor crashed upon Golarion, it shook the foundations of creation, which held the planet and all upon it together. In the chaos, Dahak began exploring the planar boundaries, which separated his home in Hell from Golarion on the material plane. His search proved fruitful when he stumbled upon a weakness, a back door into the material plane through which he could exert his influence. This planar weakness came from Alseta's Ring, a series of 6 Ayudara, or elf gates, constructed by Candleron the Sculptor. Candleron was a sage among the elves, and the first to construct the legendary elf gates, which served as the portal network which allowed the elves to spread across Avestan and Garund. Alseta's Ring had been a series of 6 Ayudara built in close proximity to one another, an experiment which Candleron used to further develop gates which could shift between linked locations. Though Candleron himself had long ago vanished from the world, Alseta's Ring had been left behind, and in the chaos of Earthfall it had been forgotten by the elves. One of these 6 gates, the Hunter Gate, which connected to central Garund, had a minor magical flaw which made it vulnerable to interference, and it was this flaw which Dahak exploited. Dahak poured his essence into the Hunter Gate, creating a sentient manifestation of himself on Golarion. Dahak, though, was clever in the creation of this manifestation. He limited it to only the smallest sliver of his divine power, one which, in the wake of Earthfall and the chaos of the Age of Darkness, would likely go unnoticed by Apsu. Thus, Dahak's manifestation was able to rain fiery destruction down upon the Mwangi expanse with impunity. Through his manifestation, Dahak could live out his need for destruction right under his father's nose, with no risk of triggering the final war before he was ready. So mighty was the manifestation that it could bring about terrible cataclysms called dragon storms, which brought fire, lightning, frost, acid rain, and poisonous fumes down upon the peoples of the expanse. Even worse, these storms stoked the flames of rage and pain which Sarshalatu had hidden within the hearts of all dragons, driving all draconic beings in the storm's vicinity berserk. This frenzy caused the afflicted dragons to seek one another out and to do battle, bringing further destruction upon the already devastated landscape. But all this chaos would not go unanswered for long. Though many of the elves of Avestan had fled from Earthfall back to their home planet of Castrovel, a subset of elves remained behind. Some of these were the Mualije elves of central Garund, and one ethnic group among them, the Ekuje, decided to stand up against Dahak's rampage. But the manifestation over Garund, though only a splinter of Dahak's true power, was still a piece of divinity, and was far beyond the ability of the Ekuje to defeat with spell, spear, and bow. Desperate to free themselves from the entity which they knew as the Great Darkness, the Ekuje elves studied their ancient magical lore and prayed to the elven gods, among whom Yulral was their most favored. Finally, they discovered a mighty ritual, the Anima Invocation, which would allow them to manifest their very souls, empowering their weapons with the strength necessary to pierce the skin of a god. This power, however, came at a terrible cost, for the souls which would power the ritual would be consumed and destroyed. And so, the most brave and noble of the Ekuje willingly gave their lives, sacrificing their souls to bless the weapons of their comrades. These magical weapons proved effective, and the Ekuje succeeded in harming Dahak's manifestation, causing him to rain blood down upon the Mwangi expanse. Even so, the elves could not completely destroy the manifestation of a god. Even if they could harm the body, the god's soul was beyond their ability to kill. Instead, they took a page out of Dahak's own book. They activated the Hunter Gate once more, using the knowledge of their ancestors, then drove the Great Darkness back toward the gate. There, they slew the body once and for all, leaving the spirit of the god adrift. Then they cast the spirit back into the Hunter Gate. Rather than simply sending him to some other gate, however, the Ekuje sprung a clever trap. The clash between Dahak's manifestation and the power of the Anima Invocation overloaded the connection between the Hunter Gate and the Mwangi Expanse, and the corresponding gate in Alcetta's Ring. The connection was broken, and the manifestation was trapped in the space between spaces, which the gates utilized. Alcetta's Ring was cut off permanently from the larger Ayudara network, and by the time of the Ayudine elves' return to Galarian, it would be all but forgotten. The Ekuje themselves have since preserved this conflict within their oral history, with tales of the Great Darkness and its associated corruption forming the foundation of their culture. The Ekuje are a people on guard. They are haunted by the evils which they once defeated, fully aware that corruption and wickedness will never stay defeated for long. They remain watchful of their ancestral lands, and have wiped out many cults of Dahak which have attempted to take root there over the millennia. Of particular note, the Ekuje abhor gold. Their lands are rich in gold veins, but they believe that the metal is the solidified remains of Dahak's blood, which fell upon their forests in the final battle of the ancient war. This belief is based in the idea that gold inspires greed and wickedness in dragons and humanoids alike, a fact which the Ekuje attribute to a curse on Dahak's part. Among the Ekuje, only the Keleti, a special sect of warriors sworn to sacrifice their souls should the need arise, are allowed to wear gold jewelry, and even then only after that gold has been ritually purified. It's worth noting, however, that the manifestation of Dahak, which was trapped within the Hunter Gate, did not simply go dormant. Though cut off from Dahak himself, the manifestation maintained his cruel and cunning intellect. It began experimenting with the planar essence of the space between spaces in which it had been trapped, and learned how to manipulate and infect the space, bending it to its own will. Though it never managed to escape, the manifestation of Dahak never ceased in its attempts to break free from its prison, so it very well might wreak havoc upon the material plane once again. The War of Immortals and Beyond. Though the conflict between Apsu and Dahak had stalled to a simmering Cold War for millennia by the Age of Lost Omens, the death of Gorum in 4724 signaled a change. As the war god died, his remains and blood poured out over the Great Beyond, in an event known as the God's Reign. This incredible dispersal of uncontrolled power and violent intent threw much of the world into chaos, sparking a series of disparate but interconnected conflicts called the War of Immortals. As part of the War of Immortals, the Imperial Lord Smiad, the patron of dragon slayers, made an alliance with Saint Fang, a former divine servitor of Gorum who took the form of a silver-hued dragon. Saint Fang had been twice broken, first by his own death and resurrection during the events of the Pray for Death adventure, then again by the death of his patron deity. In his desperation for purpose, he allied with Smiad, and the two beings began a crusade against the wicked dragons of Golarion. Together, they slew dozens of the most vile and powerful dragons threatening the peoples of Golarion, and in so doing made the world a much safer place. But they were brash, aggressive, and open in their fervor, and this drew the attention of Dahak. The endless destruction set upon the pair of dragon slayers with his customary fury and cruelty. Though Smiad himself struck a blow against the dragon god, it proved ineffective, as his sword shattered upon Dahak's impenetrable scales, and the force of the strike tore Smiad's own arm from his body. His death was mercifully quick. The same could not be said for Saint Fang. Dahak chose to indulge his cruelty and toyed with the lesser dragon for weeks, consuming him one slow bite at a time, then letting him escape to continue the fight. Only when Dahak had drawn the last bit of suffering from his prey did he end the slaughter. While this is doubtlessly a tragedy, this event, and certainly the broader War of Immortals, appears to have been what finally prompted Apsu to take more direct action in preparing for the eventual war with his son. For untold millennia, Apsu was little more than despondent over the idea of fighting and potentially killing his own son. His failures as a father and husband haunt his heart, holding him back from taking meaningful action. At the same time, the betrayal of Dahak, and more importantly Sarshalatu, remained a constant source of pain. For these reasons, Apsu rarely, if ever, took direct action on Golarion, preferring a light touch when he interacted at all. To his draconic followers, Apsu had even begun to seem like an absent patron. Dahak, meanwhile, was more active, but was forced to act cautiously, for fear of igniting his father's wrath before he was ready to answer it. His relative disdain for Dragonkind ensured that he never maintained a large following, though his offers of power always drew the desperate or tyrannical to his side, at least in small numbers. Now, however, with the War of Immortals, Apsu's mood has apparently shifted. He's begun taking greater interest in the goings-on of Golarion, and the actions of Dahak and other evil deities. His instructions to his relatively few followers have become more direct, clear, and actionable. Though Apsu remains a deity of peace and change, he seems to have accepted the inevitability of the coming dragon war, and has resolved to prepare for it. In the meantime, he encourages his followers to make the world a better place, either through their own actions, or by acting as patrons for artists and leaders who can do so. Even if the War of the Dragons might destroy all of Golarion, Apsans have a duty to improve the world until that day comes. The dragons of Golarion, meanwhile, know that the day will soon come when they are forced to choose a side in this simmering family dispute. Tradition holds that all dragons will be drawn into the fight on one side or another, no matter their temperament or willingness to fight. There might be some truth to this, since Sarshalatu's gift ensures that at least some of Dahak's wrath exists in the hearts of all dragonkind. Because of this, Dahak has the ability to drive all dragons into a mindless frenzy, though this ability may be limited to proximity, based on the level of power the god chooses to manifest. Even the most firmly committed conscientious objectors among dragonkind might find themselves drawn into the war onto the side of the endless destruction, as their self-control could be fully overridden. This is a horror which all dragons must live with, from the weakest hatchling to the mightiest archdragon. Speaking of, the archdragons are in many ways the prizes to claim on Golarion, at least from the perspective of Apsu and Dahak. Viewing their contest through the lens of a chess match, dragons can be seen as pieces on the board. Lesser dragons and drakes might be thought of as pawns, but archdragons, which have powers rivaling demigods, are bishops, rooks, and queens, the strongest pieces on the board, which could very well turn the tide of the fight. The Rundown. Apsu. Alright, with that groundwork laid, we can finally discuss what these faiths look like on Golarion, starting off with Apsu. Apsu is the Waybringer, the maker of all, a benevolent god of peace, leadership, and change. He can be thought of as the father of all dragonkind, the patriarch of both the draconic pantheon and draconic mortal creatures. He sees all these creations as his children, at least to some degree, though he has long ago given up his authoritarian parenting style with at least the mortal dragons. Apsu now teaches the importance of self-reliance and imparting such qualities to others, as well as the importance of self-reflection and self-improvement. His followers are most often dragons, or those with some magical, ancestral, or interpersonal connection with dragons, and he encourages these faithful to travel the world, to experience new things, and to seek out and destroy evil. According to old sources, the name Apsu is derived from two words in the Draconic language. Apsic roughly translates to founder or foundation, while Au is the Draconic word for one. Thus, Apsu is the one founder, or the one foundation. In his physical manifestation, Apsu most commonly appears as an immense dragon of impossible proportions. His scales are generally interpreted as green, though yellow and blue are common as well. The artwork I'm showing now, which is from the Draconic Codex and is my favorite depiction of Apsu, also adds an infinity halo which manifests above his head. More conventional depictions in 2nd edition show Apsu as a green dragon, with a distinctly dinosaur or lizard-like appearance, and with fun little mustache-like feelers hanging down from his snout. Back in 1st edition, however, Apsu was instead depicted as a magnificent silver dragon. At your table, it is entirely reasonable to still use this as simply one of Apsu's alternate manifestations, but Paizo is officially moving away from this depiction since the remaster. Apsu makes his home in the Immortal Ambulatory, his divine realm. The Immortal Ambulatory is capable of travel, and Apsu often transports it through the Great Beyond. He settles most often in heaven, however, and spends most of his time in the good-aligned planes more broadly. The ambulatory itself takes the form of a sphere, which contains a series of floating islands of varying size and makeup. Each island represents a unique environment, one perfectly suited to a specific subtype of dragon. The souls of Apsu's draconic followers populate these islands, each finding a comfortable home well suited to their needs and habits. Apsu himself resides on the largest island at the center of the realm, within a structure called the Opalescent Cathedral. Here, he is attended by his most loyal followers. This cathedral, as well as the floating monolithic temples which dot the islands of the realm, are all built to tremendous scale, with large landing pads designed to allow even the largest archdragons to land comfortably and join in worship. Apsu's teachings to his followers can be roughly boiled down to 3 ideas. Travel the world and appreciate what you see, actively oppose evil with violence if necessary, and help others to become self-reliant. Looking beyond Apsu's edicts and anathema, his deific obedience and paladin code from 1st edition provide an excellent detailed insight into the specifics of his ideals. His deific obedience, for example, instructs followers to travel a short distance over the course of a half hour, all the while studying the terrain and understanding how it might be used tactically in combat scenarios. At the end of this brief journey, the follower is then to turn around and go back to where they started, this time appreciating the beauty of their environment while expressing gratitude to Apsu for the part he played in the creation of all that they see. This melding of militarism with nature appreciation is a fantastic and flavorful synthesis of Apsu's dual nature. Followers must be ever ready for conflict, but shouldn't allow these preparations to prevent them from appreciating the good things in life, the things which the fight against Dahak is ultimately about defending. Apsu's Paladin Code goes into even further detail about the importance of travel, and how militarism is to be approached. Violence on the part of Apsans, however, should always be tempered. Apsans are forbidden from striking out without confirmation of the wickedness of their target. Once they know their cause is just, however, their violence must be swift and decisive. Mercy can and should be offered, but only ever once. A foe who betrays your mercy is unworthy of further considerations. They are untrustworthy and must be struck down. Despite this devotion to standing up to evil, Apsu doesn't encourage his followers to be brave to the point of stupidity. Apsu considers the lives of his faithful to be sacred and valuable, and the preservation of those lives is important, so they might resist evil again in the future. Except in cases where others might come to harm, Apsu teaches the importance of knowing when to retreat and conserve one's strength. After the fighting is done, a devout follower of Apsu still has work to do. They're not allowed to simply fight for those in need of protection. A good Apsan will spend their time passing useful skills along to those who need them. These might include skills like weaponscraft, tactical training, or information on combating monsters. In a broader sense, this might also include teaching survival or professional skills, though this would likely be a rare occurrence, since followers of Apsu aren't necessarily experts on non-combat fields. One skill set which many Apsans do teach is the construction of civic defenses. A substantial subset of Apsu's faithful focus on architecture and construction, putting these skills to use by constructing walls, forts, gates, and other structures which can make a community defensible. These architects frequently use the phrase, "it shall be made," when they agree to construct a structure for their allies. This phrase has since spread out to other members of the faith, and has taken on a metaphorical meaning, being used nowadays to announce the making of an agreement. This connection to architecture might seem a little out of place, but I think it might have something to do with Gasham, the son born after Dahak's betrayal. Recall that Gasham was originally intended to be the architect, before he was appointed to take Dahak's place. It's possible that, after Gasham took his place at his father's side, Apsu absorbed some of his child's interest in architecture and construction. Alternatively, and this is my preferred interpretation, as Apsu forced a role upon Gasham which the child himself did not want, perhaps Apsu had a moment of introspection. Perhaps he realized that he might very well be committing the same mistake he made with Dahak, forcing responsibility upon a child who didn't ask for it. Perhaps, then, he took up an interest in architecture, passing these teachings along to his followers so he and the son who would serve as his right hand would have common ground on which they could work together. What's that? No, I don't have any issues with my father. Why do you ask? Finally, when the fight is won and the innocent have been trained to defend themselves, a devout follower of Apsu will not rest on their laurels. In the absence of evil to oppose, or allies to train, an Apsan will pack up their gear and take to the road, seeking new opportunities to do the works of their god in the world once again. These travels often present opportunities for further self-reflection and philosophical pondering. As travelers depart from their friends or allies, they might utter the phrase, "to returning," a type of drinkless toast or well-wish intended to express a friendly goodbye and a desire to see their friends again in the future. All these lessons are communicated to followers in the Draconic Apsu, the holy text of Apsu's faith. The text is about 4,000 lines long, and details the history of Apsu, the creation of the first dragons, and the ideological conflict between good and evil. The Draconic Apsu was penned by a gold dragon named Gunnarex, a learned sage who accidentally entered the immortal ambulatory unannounced, at a time which the sourcebooks only describe as inopportune. I'll leave the interpretation of that phrase up to you. Interestingly, Gunnarex, the author, eventually became an atheist, denying not the existence of the gods but their worthiness of worship. Despite this, Apsu still acknowledges his work as the proper holy text for his faith. During their wanderings, followers of Apsu will generally celebrate 2 religious holidays throughout the year. The Time of Reminiscence, held on the first day of the winter season, is intended to be a time of reflection and meditation. Followers will find a place of solitude, then think back on the events of their past, which they find especially impactful, generally focusing on friends, relatives, and past loves, especially those lost or left behind. This is intended to parallel Apsu's own contemplation of the accumulated changes the world has experienced since it was first created. The other major Apsan holiday is Wanderer's Escape, celebrated on the first day of summer. This day is celebrated as a time of travel, and devout Apsans will spend it wandering the land, beginning a week-long journey through unknown areas. Again, as they travel, they will split their time between making tactical observations and appreciating nature for its own inherent beauty. On Golarion, the faith of Apsu is generally a niche and rarely held belief. Few humanoid mortals will ever make direct contact with a dragon, let alone the faith of the draconic creator god. No centralized church exists on Golarion to coordinate the efforts of the faithful, or to make concerted efforts toward evangelism. As such, there exist few humanoids who worship Apsu specifically, though a slightly larger number will at least acknowledge him and offer the occasional prayer when preparing for a journey, training others in useful skills, or preparing for a battle against a dragon. Most of Apsu's dedicated humanoid followers have some connection to Dragonkind. They might be dragon-aligned kobolds, dragonettes, or dragon-blooded members of other ancestries. These agents often work on the small scale to prepare for the eventual war between their god and his wayward son. They might seek to slay especially evil dragons, counteract the actions of cultists of Dahak, or recruit promising dragons to the faith of Apsu. They might also make alliances with the rare followers of Apsu's more agreeable children, Gasham, Brixori, Turvu, or Illuma. Notably, Apsu only rarely makes direct contact with the humanoids among his faithful. There's a lot of speculation about why this is. Some believe that Apsu simply worries that the humanoid mind might misinterpret his draconic nature, while others claim that Apsu sees humanoids as unworthy of his direct grace. Apsu himself has made no clarification on the issue. Of course, Apsu's faith is most common among dragons, as nearly all dragons are aware of their deific progenitors. Most dragons know from a very young age of the coming war between Apsu and Dahak, and they know that, one way or another, they will likely be forced to choose a side. I'll talk in a bit about the subtypes of dragon which might be most drawn to Apsu, since the benevolent metallic dragons are no longer canon. Even dragons who are devout followers of Apsu, however, don't provide much in the way of church structure. Many dragons live fiercely independent lives, and even those who are highly social are limited in how much they can interact with other dragons, due to the tremendous resource strain they place on their environment. So even dragons who seek to teach Apsu's faith to others are somewhat limited in their reach. They're more likely to be able to pass these teachings along to mortal allies, if they find such relationships appealing. A magma dragon, for instance, might protect a tribe of dragon-scale kobolds, or a community of Nari who serve her, and might preach the faith of Apsu to them as a result. A whisper dragon might have an informant network spanning several nations or continents, and he might offer the teachings of Apsu along to his many informants as a means of expressing gratitude for their service. Even so, these hypotheticals are certainly the exception rather than the rule. And, broadly speaking, Apsu's faith lacks structure on Golarion. As an additional note, historically only gold and bronze dragons consistently paid homage to Apsu, but their new interpretations, the Vizier and Sage dragons respectively, don't necessarily maintain those same traditions in the post-remaster era. The remastered dragons are far more individualistic, so devotion to Apsu would be a much more personal choice for any given dragon, rather than something heavily influenced by draconic subtype. There is, however, one organization which defies this trend in individualism. The Platinum Band is a small order of humans and other mortal humanoids based out of the Taldan city of Opara. While not a formal church which holds worship ceremonies, the Platinum Band seeks to provide order and focus to humanoid Apsans, who might lack a dragon's innate independence and thus require direction. I haven't found any reason why the Platinum Band was founded in Taldor, of all places, but it might be related to the infamous Dragon Plague, a period from 1,000 years back in Taldan history when the native population of benevolent dragons was driven mad by an artifact called an Orb of Dragonkind. This allowed more malevolent dragons to move into northern Taldor, where they rained terror from the skies for centuries. Again, though, this is just an educated guess on my part. Beyond Opara, the Platinum Band also has outposts in the Puddles district of Absalom, and in Thuvia. Please note, the Orbs of Dragonkind will likely be erased from the Pathfinder lore as a result of the remaster, but we haven't gotten clarification on what the new canon looks like in this instance. If we look beyond Golarion, the icy planet Triaxis also hosts a notable collection of Apsu's faithful. I'll get into this in a little more detail on the GM section of the video, but the benevolent Dragon Legion faction is devoted to Apsu and his faith. Their broad goal is to create a large and disciplined army of draconic warriors, who can serve Apsu in the final battle with Dahak. Back on Golarion, formal priests of Apsu lead largely itinerant lives. Outside of their necessary daily preparations for spellcasting and similar abilities, they rarely have a defined order or structure which their days follow, at least on a large timescale. Most of their time is spent traveling, searching for people or regions in need of Apsu's assistance. Once they find something of interest, be it a cult of Dahak in need of eradication or innocents in need of protection, the priest will likely settle down temporarily to address the situation until it's resolved. Individual clergy members are free to go about this business however they wish, due to the lack of a formal church hierarchy. Evangelism is rarely a priority for Apsu or his priests, but because the faith is relatively obscure, followers of the Waybringer might spend a fair amount of time explaining their beliefs anyway. These interactions often lead to cordial, if not friendly, responses from those they visit, since most laypeople find Apsu and his followers to be largely benevolent and helpful. The itinerant lifestyle encouraged by Apsu's teachings lead even his non-priestly followers to often become adventurers. Adventurers dedicated to Apsu excel when fighting dragons, at least compared to other warriors and spellcasters. While they might come from many walks of life, a lot of humanoid Apsans have experienced trauma at the hands, or claws, of an evil dragon. Worship sites to Apsu tend to fall into two categories. The most common of these are the shrines to Apsu, often built along roadways to accommodate the rare humanoid follower of the Waybringer. These shrines are generally small and private, and are decorated primarily with a mirror set into the floor. These mirrors are intended to allow the faithful to look at themselves and reflect upon their past actions. The corrupting powers of evil are ever present, and this period of reflection is intended to allow Apsans to assess their internal harmony. Formal temples to Apsu are vanishingly rare, but they leave a tremendous impact on those who see them. Most temples to Apsu are constructed primarily from stone, and are decorated almost exclusively with gold, silver, and platinum. They are often enormous in scale, being constructed to accommodate at least one or more dragons. Some contain altars and daises made from stone, but the primary feature is the immense mirror set into the floor. This has the same meaning as the smaller mirrors in the shrines I described a moment ago. Some of these temples also feature a draconic statue poised over the mirror, representative of Apsu himself. The presence of the statue gives the temple interior the appearance of Apsu's holy symbol. Relationships. Apsu. Apsu is a benevolent deity, and thus gets along at least fairly well with most other good-aligned gods and goddesses. Dorag and Sarenrae were there during the battle with Rovagug, for instance, and both remain allies with the Waybringer to this day, in no small part because of the role he played in successfully imprisoning the rough beast. Caden Kalian, by contrast, is a more recent arrival on the deific stage, but he still considers himself an ally of Apsu due to their shared love of travel and their shared opposition to tyranny and evil. Most other good deities will passively support Apsu in his efforts, but he's largely solitary in his concerns and activities, and he only rarely actively seeks out allies. Apsu's most prominent ally, at least outside of the ancestral draconic gods, is certainly Iyomide. Upon her ascension to divinity, Iyomide actively sought out Apsu, having previously made herself familiar with his teachings and followers. Iomade saw potential in Apsu's power and wisdom, and intended to draw the Waybringer out of his relative isolation so he might take a more active and prominent role in the fight against evil. Apsu, for his part, met Iomede's earnestness and enthusiasm with stubborn isolationism, but even his resolve softened in the face of her righteous intent. Though he remains focused primarily on Dahak to this day, Apsu has conceded to ally himself with Iomade, and both deities have sworn a mutual defense pact, acknowledging one another as forces for good in the universe. Notably, Iomede's divine servitor, Peace Through Vigilance, is a golden dragon, infused with celestial power. This being refers to the inheritor as Mother Iomade, leading some followers to speculate that she and Apsu had some sort of romantic, or at least carnal, relationship. This, however, flies in the face of both deities' normal characterization, and the prevailing opinion among religious scholars is that Peace Through Vigilance instead sprang into existence when the alliance between the two deities was declared, as a living manifestation of their friendship. While Apsu is broadly opposed to all evil deities, his greatest enemy remains Dahak. Interestingly, Apsu is generally patient, tempered, and even polite when faced with evil deities. For instance, Asmodeus has approached Apsu multiple times throughout history, attempting to strike a bargain with the Draconic Patriarch. According to rumors, these offers have been to subvert Dahak's forces on the eve of the final battle between father and son. Recall that this would likely be easy to achieve for Asmodeus, since Dahak makes his home in Hell, Asmodeus's own domain. Apsu has, to this point, politely but very firmly refused the Prince of Darkness's offers, recognizing that, no matter the benefit he would reap, the price the Archfiend would require would be far too steep. Gods of war and conflict likely have a complex relationship with both Apsu and Dahak. Until recently, Gorum was quite excited for the coming Draconic War, and encouraged his followers to participate on either side. The successor war gods since Gorum's death will likely pick sides based on their own worldviews, with Zuriel and her ilk joining Dahak, and more benevolent war deities like Regathiel or Felena joining up with Apsu's forces. The extent to which any of these deities might aid the Draconic gods before the war kicks off would vary significantly from god to god. Apsu is also a member of a deific pantheon which PCs can follow and worship. The Anointing of Kings is a pantheon focused on the mythical divine right of kings and the idea of self-improvement and justice. Apsu is joined in this pantheon by Shizuru and Narisemenek. Shizuru is the Empress of Heaven, a Tian deity of rulership and justice. Narisemenek is the Crownless, the Maker of Kings, a Protean lord of ascension and destined power. This pantheon, whose mechanical details I've posted on this slide, emerged recently in the wake of the God's Reign. The God's Reign heralded a period of uncertainty and instability on Golarion, prompting the rise of a religious movement which seeks strong authority and leadership to restore a sense of normalcy and safety to everyday life. Even in this pantheon, however, there remains disagreement, with Apsu and Shizuru encouraging the building of coalitions and political alliances, and Narisemenek encouraging swifter revolutionary action. Moving away from strictly deific allies, Apsu also has a number of divine servitors who've been presented by Paizo. The herald of Apsu is Origenus, a silver-hued dragon imbued with celestial divine power. Origenus is, despite his tremendous power, not an especially violent servant. He focuses on the construction of defensive works, traveling the material plane and building fortresses and walls to protect those who are threatened by Dahak and other wicked dragons. His most useful tool in this regard is his unique breath weapon, which deals cold damage, but which more importantly rapidly solidifies into blocks of ice. This ice is permanent and well-suited to construction, as it remains hard as rock, but quickly warms to the ambient temperature. Origenus is easily recognized by the faithful for the large and prominent glasses which adorn his face. Less prominent than Origenus, but no less important, is Blameless Flame. This coatl, who has served Apsu since time immemorial, spends his days seeking out holy texts of Dahak, which he purges from existence with righteous celestial flame. His goal is simple: If the words and teachings of Dahak are erased, then the endless destruction will lose momentum in his efforts to gain followers and build up his armies. Now, my favorite of Apsu's servitors is definitely Cyrax the Platinum. Long ago, the archwizard Zin, and yes, we are going back to ancient Thassalon one more time, stole the mind of a dragon and attempted to implant it into one of his experimental clockwork designs. Zin was unparalleled in his day in the study of clockwork, and this may have been an early experiment leading to the development of the clockwork reliquary, the receptacle for his own aging soul. This particular experiment resulted in the creation of Cyrax the Platinum, a clockwork dragon imbued with the sentience of a true dragon. Cyrax, however, proved unwilling to submit to Zin's rule, and soon escaped. She fled to Apsu's immortal ambulatory, and begged the Waybringer to restore her mortal form. Apsu, though, claimed that to restore her was beyond him. In recompense, however, he complimented her willpower and the strength of her heart. He infused her with divine power and invited her into his service. Before the remaster, Cyrax had originally been a brass dragon. I like the idea of converting her to having the mind of a whisper dragon in the post-remaster era, since the whisper dragon's famous information network is such a cool idea for a deific servitor to use. Outside of his specific divine servitors, Apsu is served by many mortal dragons on Golarion. Historically, the metal dragons of First Edition were almost universally good, and were broadly aligned with Apsu and his interests. In the post-remaster age, Paizo's new dragons are far more individualistic, and don't fall into such binding categories. Still, a few draconic subtypes are easily aligned with Apsu's intentions and areas of interest, and are therefore more likely to be drawn to his teachings and his church. Imperial and Executor dragons are the ones which stand out the most in this regard. Imperial dragons are benevolent divine dragons who seek to aid others, protect the innocent, and oppose evil. Executor dragons, meanwhile, are a manifestation of divine fury and the idea of the divine smite. Both would likely be drawn to Apsu's good nature and his opposition to Dahak. Oath dragons, the new interpretation of silver dragons, are known to find worthy causes, then pledge their support to them, and more than a few would likely have made such an oath to Apsu and his church. Phase dragons, and to a lesser extent cloud dragons, might be aligned with Apsu's commands regarding travel, and their powers and personalities would be well suited to wandering the world. Recall also that Apsu is a deity of time, and thus more than a few time dragons might find their way to his faith as well. Other dragons might find their way to Apsu's church, but these are the subtypes which make the most thematic sense to me. The Rundown. Dahak. Well, now that we've covered the father, it's time to look at the son. Dahak is the endless destruction, the sorrow maker, the false wyrm, a malicious deity of destruction, violence, and fire. Dahak can be most easily thought of as the destroyer to Apsu's creator, the corrupter of all his father's creations and great works, who seeks to see these great things brought low. He hates all forms of existence, including Dragonkind itself, and sees even his most devoted followers as little more than tools for the advancement of his goals, and soldiers to be fed into the final war with Apsu. Dahak, however, is capable of surprising degrees of restraint, and he teaches the importance of studying methods of destruction and disasters throughout history. While Dahak has no loyalty to his followers, he's more than willing to provide divine power to those who serve him. Dragons, and those who descend from them, fill out the ranks of Dahak's faithful, but non-draconic followers might also gain dragon-related powers from the Great Destruction. Dahak himself manifests as an immense dragon of black and red coloration. His most prominent scales are the deep black of adamantine, while the smaller scales closer to his skin appear a deep red. Other interpretations make the black a more universal color, with the searing light and heat of hellfire shining from the gaps between his scales. While many depictions show Dahak with black or deep red eyes, some artwork instead shows bright blue eyes. It's possible that this is intended to indicate Dahak's original manifested form, before he felt corruption, hatred, and flame. I like the idea of Dahak's form having shifted after his corruption, and that Apsu might look upon him now and barely recognize the son he raised. That is, however, contradicted by other artwork depicting Dahak as a hatchling, which shows him as a red dragon with black scale patterns. It's also worth mentioning that Dahak's depictions have not meaningfully changed since the remaster. After his defeat by Apsu, Dahak fled to Hell, and there he established his deific domain. In the depths of Kaina, the 8th layer of Hell, Dahak carved the Adamantine Morass, a crisscrossing labyrinth of tunnels, carved or melted through a realm made entirely of adamantine. I've found no confirmation of this, but I suspect that the Adamantine Morass was formed from the remains of Dahak's failed attempts at the adamantine edifice. His breath of hellfire, alongside Apsu's own righteous breath, melted the statue, which cooled and formed the foundation of the morass. According to legend, Dahak permanently secured this realm when it was given to him by Mephistopheles, the archdevil who rules over Kaina. In exchange, Dahak forged Visinir, the quill which Mephistopheles uses to write contracts. Some scholars speculate that Asmodeus himself prompted Mephistopheles to make the offer, intending to make use of Dahak's presence in Hell at some later date. Within the adamantine morass, Dahak particularly enjoys hunting trespassers and uninvited guests. He stalks his prey throughout the winding tunnels of his realm mercilessly, treating it as a kind of sport. Dahak's teachings are ultimately quite simple. Followers are encouraged to fuel the fires of hatred within their hearts, always keeping them at a low simmer. The intention here is to always be prepared to fly into a rage and slaughter those around you, so you might sow discord and damage however you see fit, and whenever the need arises. Even in his deific obedience from First Edition, Dahak orders his followers to stoke the flames of their hatred during a period of prayer, after which they take their anger out on a nearby object, smashing it to pieces. Not to distract from the point here, but this really reminds me of Kylo Ren's temper tantrum in The Force Awakens when he first finds out about Rey. Also, content warning here for a brief surface-level discussion of self-harm. Skip ahead about 20 seconds to avoid that. At the conclusion of performing their daily obedience, devotees of Dahak must then take up the shards of the broken object and use it to cut their own flesh. Reflecting a portion of their destructive hatred back upon themselves might be intended to teach the lesson that Dahak is not protective of his faithful. While a follower of Dahak is encouraged to lash out and destroy the world around them, this destructive potential should be controlled, or at least aimed, in an effective manner. Dahak's First Edition Paladin Code makes clear that the follower is in control of when their fury is unleashed. The power might come from Dahak, but he grants followers the authority to put it to use. There are, however, several situations in which followers must lash out in anger. Once a fight begins, for example, mercy is off the table, and Dahak's faithful must see a fight through to the end. If a fight has not yet begun, however, they still have the freedom to let an enemy go. This capacity for control and judgment is best reflected in the saying, "My patience is like fire," a common phrase among followers of the Endless Destruction. In situations where a follower of Dahak has been insulted, though, they are duty-bound to achieve vengeance. This command doesn't necessarily force a follower to kill the offending party, but their broader tendencies toward violence imply that such a result would be a regular occurrence. These teachings are often communicated through Dahak's holy text, the Pyre of Dahak. Dahak witnessed the creation of the draconic Apsu by the ancient dragon Gunnarex, and he grew jealous. He took Gunnarex into his realm by force, and tortured the sage until he conceded to write a similar text for the Endless Destruction's followers. Gunnarex succeeded in capturing the horrors of Dahak's intended future in the pages of a new book, but the effort took a tremendous toll. In response to the incredible evil he'd been forced to witness, Gunnarex plucked out his own eyes and abandoned all faith in the gods, becoming an atheist. Still, his work persisted, and the Pyre of Dahak remains a potent recruitment tool for the Church to this day. Speaking of which, the Church of Dahak is generally dispersed and decentralized, with small pockets of the faithful organizing in secret all across the Inner Sea region. Though the faith of Dahak is not well known, his followers have destructive tendencies, which would quickly draw negative attention. For that reason, religious activities are generally undertaken in secret. Contrastingly, unholy symbols of Dahak might be displayed somewhat openly, with the faithful relying on the obscurity of the faith to protect them in most situations. Successful cults of Dahak are those which master the art of secrecy and obfuscation, either operating under the noses of local authorities or far away from civilized society. These localized pockets of Dahak's faithful actively seek out sources of power and authority related to their god. Dahak only rarely communicates directly with his followers, leaving many of those drawn to his teachings in need of guidance or help. They might seek out priests or other religious leaders in the church, a search which often leads them to dragons. Ironically, this is frequently a disastrous idea, as relatively few dragons actively serve Dahak, and basically all those who don't serve him actively oppose him. If humanoid worshippers of Dahak approach a cinder dragon, for instance, assuming she serves the endless destruction, the dragon might simply mock or reprimand them for their foolish choice of a god, then burn them to a crisp before eating them. When these searches are successful, however, cults of Dahak worshippers might rise up around a draconic high priest. These would likely become strictly hierarchical organizations, with relative power denoting rank among the cult members. Cults of Dahak, even those led by a powerful dragon, might remain mostly peaceful for a long time, unwilling to commit to a larger fight with their neighbors. When their rage and strength have built up sufficiently, however, they are known to act out quickly and with overwhelming force, totally destroying nearby communities. It's a widely known fact that Dahak has no loyalty or love for his followers. They're tools which he will use, just as his divine power is a tool for the faithful. This extremely transactional relationship doesn't seem to drive away followers. Indeed, it seems to hold some appeal for the more cynical mortals, who are content to know the terms of the deal and reap the benefits. True believers exist as well, and many appreciate the more controlled take on destruction and devastation that Dahak presents, especially in comparison to Rovagug, who lacks the capacity for such restraint. In truth, though Dahak's faith appeals to a fairly small number of individuals, they come from a wide variety of backgrounds. The transactional nature of the faith appeals to assassins and mercenaries, while the assurance of the value of power for its own sake appeals to tyrants, warlords, and the more egotistical dragons. Dahak generally takes a hands-off approach with his followers, leaving even his priests with just the broad command to prepare the mortal world for his arrival and the final battle with his father. This is a pretty loose command, and is open to some interpretation. Before the remaster, this was commonly understood to mean that Dahak's faithful had a duty to hunt down and kill metallic dragons, so they might weaken Apsu's forces. In the new absence of the metallic dragons, this command likely still holds true for good dragons, or dragons known to serve Apsu. Good examples might include Imperial or Executor dragons, but other dragon types could certainly be targeted as well. Human followers of Apsu, however, are surprisingly excluded from this command, at least in most cases. Dahak himself hopes to defeat and consume any mortal humanoids foolish enough to side with his father, and so prefers that his own followers leave them alone when they can. That's not to say that Dahak's faithful wouldn't or couldn't fight a group of Apsans that they came across, only that they likely wouldn't actively seek them out for elimination. When Dahak does require specific actions of his followers, he's been known to send terrible cataclysmic visions. These are universally difficult to interpret, and are often mistaken as signs of madness. Any follower who receives such a vision, then, must defend its veracity with force, since other acolytes will almost certainly doubt either the vision itself or the interpretation of the recipient. The conflicts this causes are likely pleasing to Dahak, which is, I suspect, why he sticks with this method of communication. Dahak's most favored servants are those who bear some connection in their blood to Dragonkind. Kobolds make up a substantial portion of his faithful, as do dragon-blooded humanoids, and sorcerers with the draconic bloodline. Many true dragons, even evil ones, have abandoned the faith of Dahak, recognizing that he would bring about their end. For that reason, any dragon who remains faithful is a tremendous asset, and even non-dragons with a connection to Dragonkind have symbolic value. The Church of Dahak recognizes two named holidays, the Day of Amends and the Day of Release. The Day of Amends is an annual celebration, when the faithful of Dahak attempt to lure a wicked dragon who abandoned Dahak's teachings back to the church. The release, by contrast, only occurs once every 1,000 years, and is a celebration of unchecked violence. During the release, followers of Dahak fly into an uncontrolled rage, and slaughter all those in their vicinity. These events go down in legend, but no scholars on Golarion can accurately date when the last release happened. The next one might very well be right around the corner. On Golarion, the largest congregation of Dahak's faithful is almost certainly in the Shackles, on the island called Dahak's Fang. Here, the Cinder Archdragon Ashak the Annihilator, great name by the way, serves as the high priestess to the endless destruction, and she has gathered a host of lesser dragons and dragonkind servants who are completely loyal to her. She rules over her flock with an iron fist, and her fury is not easily ignored. Even the free captains of the Shackles give her island a wide berth. In central Garund, cults of Dahak regularly crop up in the heart of the Mwangi Expanse. Historically, the Ekuje elves have driven these cults to extinction, but they always manage to reform a few centuries later. Further north, in Thuvia, followers of Dahak have gathered in notable numbers, and made an alliance with the faithful of the Div demigod Ahriman. Deep beneath Golarion's surface, in the Darklands realm of Narvoth, multiple tribes of draconic kobolds are unified around Dahak's faith, some in service to a wicked dragon, and others entirely independently. And, just like Apsu, Dahak's faith is extremely popular on the frozen planet of Triaxis, a bit farther out in Golarion's star system. Again, I'll address Triaxis in a bit more detail near the end of the video. Temples to Dahak are often hidden away from polite society, for fear that followers of the more enterprising benevolent deities, like Apsu or Iomade, might discover and destroy them. Most are constructed underground, either in pre-existing caves or in specially carved spaces built for the purpose. Dahak is extremely vain, and appreciates any monuments or temples built in his honor, and so followers are encouraged to decorate these spaces in such a way that they inspire awe and fear in those who witness them. The grandest temples are constructed by wicked archdragons, and are made from worked stone. Chambers in these temples are enormous, large enough to make even elder dragons feel small. Magic is used to conjure light within these structures, and light sources are intended to resemble draconic breath weapons. Smaller structures dedicated to Dahak might share these same design sensibilities, but would be built at a scale more attainable by humanoid followers, most often kobolds. Relationships. Dahak. Even among the many evil deities in the Pathfinder campaign setting, Dahak is something of an outcast. He's too destructive and cunning to be trusted by most, and residing in Hell keeps him largely isolated from the Daemon Harbingers and the Demon Lords, who might be the most willing to work with him. The Lords of Hell largely leave him to his own devices, with the exception of Mephistopheles and Asmodeus. Asmodeus has a cordial relationship with the Endless Destruction, and almost certainly has plans to exploit his eventual conflict with his father Apsu. Interestingly, Asmodeus controls the key to the Dead Vault, Rovagog's prison. Considering that Dahak wants to destroy all of Golarion once he defeats his father and unleash the rough beast upon the world, I would have expected Asmodeus to have made some sort of objection by now. He's almost certainly got something up his sleeve. Essentially all good-aligned deities actively oppose Dahak and his servants, and the same could be said for most neutral deities as well. Only Calistria has made a notable attempt at aligning with him. She has tried on several occasions to seduce the Draconic Destroyer, though each of these attempts has ended in failure. According to legend, she even bears a scar on her body from one such event. This appears to have been the last straw, for Calistria now encourages her followers to watch out for the followers of Dahak, manipulating them only when necessary to avoid further confrontation. Just like Apsu and many other deities, Dahak has a number of divine servitors worth discussing. Chronoroth is a unique ancient rhyme dragon, and serves as Dahak's herald. She has a single-minded passion for the slaying of good-aligned dragons and the servants of Apsu, and collects the heads of such targets as trophies. These heads she displays on her body, impaled on the spikes which run down her back. Each is infused with magic, and grants her access to new powers. When she kills a foe with her freezing breath, she can raise them as an ice golem under her command. The roiling mass was birthed when Dahak's hatred seeped into the environment around him after he unleashed his terrible hellfire breath. The liquefied stone before him became infused with his malice and rose up, ready to serve. The roiling mass itself is imbued only with a base intellect. It can perceive the world around it, but only ever lashes out in a fit of uncontrolled destruction. Those overwhelmed by the mass's lava are consumed and destroyed, but echoes of their forms might still be seen in its body from time to time thereafter. Finally, emissary Rixmar was presented as a gift to Dahak by the archdevil Mephistopheles. Rixmar is well suited to Dahak, as he is a wrathful and temperamental creature. This fury caused him to break the contracts he wrote while in Mephistopheles' service, forcing the archdevil to dole out a severe punishment. He eviscerated the lesser contract devil's legs, an injury which remains unhealed to this day. Rixmar now walks with a permanent limp, and uses a large quill as a crutch. Still, he remains the most diplomatic being in Dahak's service, and the Endless Destruction employs him as a diplomat and emissary to this day. Beyond his named divine servitors, Dahak is served by a number of mortal dragons. Back in First Edition, the chromatic dragons were inherently wicked, having been corrupted by Dahak. That said, they mostly hated Dahak, and generally refused to serve him, recognizing him for the threat that he was. The number of dragons who actively served Dahak was small, but those who did were generally chromatic dragons. Since the remaster, a wider variety of dragons might be drawn to Dahak's faith. At the front of the list are the diabolic dragons, the draconic manifestation of hell itself. While generally a bit more controlled than Dahak himself, diabolic dragons are not in fact bound by the contracts they write, and could serve admirably in Dahak's final battle. Both cinder and magma dragons are connected to the idea of fiery destruction. Cinder dragons share Dahak's vanity and tendency towards cruelty. Magma dragons, meanwhile, share his might makes right attitude, but their inherent sense of responsibility for those they rule over might conflict with Dahak's own teachings. Finally, barrage dragons are similar to cinder dragons in terms of their destructive capacity and their need to unleash power. The swirling arcane energy within them needs some form of escape, and the faith of Dahak might present a barrage dragon with plenty of opportunities to let loose. The Old Canon. So, I'm going to discuss the many previous interpretations of the Apsu and Dahak story which Paizo has presented over the years. These two have had a storied history in the lore, going all the way back to before the Pathfinder 1e system existed as a unique rule set. None of what I'm discussing in this section is canon in the post-remaster era, but I think it's fun and interesting to see how things have developed over the years. Plus, it might be fun for players or GMs to incorporate some of these ideas into the lore at your table, as breakaway sects of the faith on Golarion, or as conflicting information presented in recovered ancient religious texts. In the earliest sources I can find, back in 1e, Draconic lore begins with the two waters, one fresh and one salt. Though these two waters were different, they existed in relative harmony, and they poured their might into existence and created the first gods. The fresh water created the universe as a canvas on which the gods could paint, and there the gods made mortal life. The first of these new gods, though, was cruel and vicious. He went into the universe and filled part of it with his fire and fury. This was Dahak, and the place he corrupted was hell. Dahak destroyed all that his siblings, the other gods, created, and in his wrath he brought death to reality for the first time. Sometime later, the waters created something new, 6 pure forms of metal. Dahak recognized this as an opportunity and acted swiftly. He named these 6 new forms platinum, gold, silver, bronze, brass, and copper, and gave them shape and molded them after his own mighty and terrible form. These might have been considered gifts had the Sorrow Maker stopped there. Instead, he shattered the metals upon the universe, breaking them into smaller fragments, which retained their gifted forms. These were the first true dragons, and Dahak began to hunt them for sport, killing them only after he'd driven them to exhaustion. Both waters took note of the cruelties of their wayward son, and the fresh water departed his primordial home beyond creation so he might intervene. He manifested a form of power, a shining righteous dragon, and became Apsu, the first. Then he confronted Dahak, rallying the metallic dragons about him in a great host. The battle which followed was fierce and bloody, but Apsu soon stood victorious over his son. He readied himself to strike the killing blow, but in that moment, the salt water stepped in. Unwilling to allow the death of her firstborn son, the salt water offered her power to the dragons who'd been injured in the fight against Dahak. Some of these dragons, driven to desperation by their pain, accepted the offer, and were infused with the salt water's essence. Their forms shifted, and they became the first chromatic dragons. They rose up against Apsu, and their rebellion allowed Dahak to flee back to hell. Enraged at the salt water's betrayal, Apsu returned to her to demand an explanation. Upon his arrival, however, Apsu was betrayed yet again, for the mate who greeted him was no longer formless. "I am the mother of all," she declared in her new many-headed shape, "and you, Apsu, are to blame for the deaths of my children. So I, then, shall be Tiamat." And in her fury, Tiamat struck out at the exhausted Apsu, driving him back into the mortal realm. Apsu took shelter beneath a great tree, and was eventually found by his remaining metallic children. They fled across the multiverse, pursued by Dahak and the wicked dragons who served him. Finally, Apsu chose the small and isolated world of Golarion. Here, he and his followers would make a stand, far from the prying eyes of the treacherous Tiamat. So yeah, Tiamat, of D&D fame, was the original mate of Apsu, and the mother of Dahak and all of Dragonkind. This would remain the case for the better part of a decade. The story of Apsu, Dahak, and Tiamat was first printed in Fortress of the Stone Giants, Book 4 of the Rise of the Runelords adventure path, and was repeated and iterated upon in further publications like Dragons Revisited, Gods and Magic, and Faiths of Golarion. Later, in sourcebooks like Faiths of Purity and Corruption, and even further in Inner Sea Faiths, this story was expanded. In this telling, the threat of Rovagug, the rough beast, was what drew Apsu's attention to Golarion in the first place. He joined the battle against Rovagug, lending his strength to the other gods. Dahak saw this and recognized an opportunity. He joined the battle, fully intending to betray his father and strike a killing blow. In the face of the rough beast's evil, however, Dahak changed his mind. He helped to drive Rovagug into the cage, then met his father after the battle. Here, the story begins to take the shape which is now canon. Dahak makes an oath to face his father on Golarion, threatening to destroy the cage if Apsu does not meet him in battle on the day of his choosing. This would be the final major iteration on this mythology until 2nd edition. With Lost Omen's travel guide, we got a new interpretation of this myth, and this one was the largest departure so far. In this telling, Apsu and Dahak were two among a host of draconic creator gods, collectively known as the First Dragons. This myth claims that the First Dragons created all things in the inner sphere, including matter, land masses and oceans, the sky, plants, animals, and even sentient life. Of these first dragons, Apsu and Dahak were especially important, and they created together, as father and son, with no ill will between them. When the other gods lured Rovagug to Golarion, Apsu and Dahak both joined in the fight. Their combined might was key to imprisoning the rough beast, but victory came at a terrible price. During the fighting, Rovagug's corruption reached into Dahak's heart and planted itself deep. The son of Apsu was overcome by hatred and malice, and became the Sorrowmaker, fleeing to hell to begin plotting his father's demise. This version of the story makes no specific mention of Tiamat, or a mother figure of any kind, and tries to recenter the narrative on the father-son conflict. What I can't tell is if this abandonment of Tiamat was at the direction of the higher-ups at Paizo, in possibly a pre-remaster attempt to distance the Pathfinder lore from its D&D roots. This version also seems to be an attempt to bring the Draconic mythology into closer alignment with the Windsong Testaments, the generally accepted creation story among followers of the core 20 deities in the Inner Sea region. This I find interesting, since in 2e, Paizo has really embraced contradicting mythologies when discussing their deities. Generally speaking, it's more important for the mythologies to be fascinating and believable in their own right than it is for them to fit together. Regardless of how the travel guide version came to be, however, it was not long for this world. The OGL crisis brought about the Pathfinder 2e remaster project, which demanded significant rewrites to specific aspects of the Pathfinder canon, and notably the Draconic lore. Dragons in general were completely reworked to remove the idea of chromatic and metallic division. Similarly, Tiamat, the wicked, many-headed Draconic mother goddess, needed to be removed, as that interpretation of the character was distinctly similar to D&D's version. This presented an opportunity for the writers to also retool the broader Draconic mythology, and iron out some of the ideas they'd played with over the years. Sarshalatu was slotted in for Tiamat, as a mother goddess devoted to protecting her children. Instead of becoming wicked, however, she's a much more tragic character, abandoning reality after the fight breaks out between her mate and their son. The remaining dragon gods are fleshed out as well, leading to a lot more depth. Rovagug and his influence are moved to the edges of the narrative, giving the draconic characters more independence. On top of that, the sense of eldritch weirdness, first explored with the ideas of salt and fresh water, makes a return, with Sarshalatu taking on the role of a boundless deity from before time, Apsu becoming the bringer of time and change, and thus impermanence as a concept, and Odalaz becoming a deity who chooses to exist despite his own non-existence. It's fascinating to examine the dynamics of this mythology over Paizo's publication history. Bits and pieces of the modern lore come and go over time, and different authors are noticeably interested in different aspects of the lore or the characters. The modern interpretation is certainly my favorite, but there are elements of the previous versions which I find especially compelling. The metaphor of salt and fresh waters, for instance, is something I would like to see make a comeback, as a metaphor for Sarshalatu and Apsu, as it feels very much like a real-world religious concept we could encounter here on Earth. For players who might be interested in playing characters who follow Apsu, here are a few useful details. For those using the alignment rules, Apsu is a lawful good deity who allows followers of all good alignments. His edicts are to seek and destroy evil, to travel the world, and to help others fend for themselves. Conversely, to fail to pursue a foe who has betrayed your mercy, or to attack a creature without certainty of wrongdoing, are both anathema to Apsu. He provides the healing font to clerics, and requires his clerics and champions to choose holy sanctification. Apsu has the creation, dragon, protection, and travel domains, as well as the freedom and introspection alternate domains. His holy symbol is a silver dragon above a reflective pool. Apsu's sacred colors are gold and silver. Recall that, historically, Apsu was the patron of the metallic dragons, who were on the side of good. Gold and silver being his colors are likely a holdover from the benevolence of the metallic dragons, but they remain official in the post-remaster era. With Apsu's official manifestation having been updated to that of a wizened and lizard-like dragon with pale green, yellow, and orange scales, I suspect that those three colors might be openly worn among his followers as well. Followers, and especially priests, often wear a metallic pendant in the shape of a dragon's foot as a symbol of their faith, rather than Apsu's more complex formal holy symbol. Presumably, these dragon foot pendants function as holy symbols, despite the aesthetic differences. Devotees of Apsu typically wear metallic armor, which they polish to a sheen. Even followers not trained in medium or heavy armor will incorporate metallic decorations into their clothing. Polished steel, which is silver in appearance, is the most common material, but it is frequently accented with either bronze, in the case of poorer followers, or gold, in the case of wealthier followers. Apsu has two sacred weapons, Jaws for draconic or animalistic followers, or the Staff for followers who use manufactured weapons. Draconic followers of Apsu would naturally be encouraged to use whatever natural weapons they have access to, as well as any special abilities, breath weapons, and innate spellcasting which they might possess. They certainly wouldn't be restricted to the use of their jaws by any means. The staff works well for Apsans, as it functions as both a weapon and a training tool, aiding in 2 of Apsu's edicts. Other weapon options for followers of the Waybringer might include claws or tail strikes associated with dragon-derived powers, or traditional knightly metallic weapons, which would be maintained to the same pristine degree as their armor. Notably, many Apsans have a tradition of incorporating dragon's foot imagery into their adventuring gear, such as on the pommels of their weapons. Apsu has no listed favored animal, so followers who rely on familiars or animal companions could choose any number of options without restriction. Especially thematic familiars might include the calligraphy wyrm, the fey dragonette, or the house drake. Similarly, the most thematic companion creatures are the riding dragonette, the riding drake, and the wyvern. Due to Apsu's relative obscurity on Golarion and in the Inner Sea region, none of the core ancestries are overrepresented among his faithful. Members of any playable ancestry might be drawn to Apsu's faith. 2 non-core ancestries do stand out, however, the kobold and the newly released dragonette. As of the remaster, kobolds have been reimagined as having a reverence for powerful beings called benefactors, which could include dragons, fiends, fae, or even powerful spellcasters. The presence of a benefactor can impact kobold eggs and infuse them with new traits related to the benefactor's powers. Plenty of kobolds still latch on to dragons as their benefactors. Spellhorn kobolds, for instance, might serve one of the new arcane dragons, like the Mirage Dragon. Elementheart kobolds might serve primal dragons, like the Rime, Cinder, or Stormcrown dragons. Dragon-scaled kobolds might serve any of the new dragons from the Draconic Codex. Note that the Draconic Codex also introduced a bunch of new feats for the dragon-aligned kobolds. Since dragons are drawn to the faith of Apsu, it makes sense that plenty of kobolds who serve them might also be drawn to the Waybringer. Similarly, the dragonette ancestry might be drawn to Apsu's faith. Since they are themselves lesser dragons, dragonettes might easily feel a connection to Apsu and the other draconic gods. Beyond ancestries, the dragon-blooded versatile heritage is extremely common among Apsu's non-draconic followers. Looking at mechanical classes which might thematically align with Apsu's goals and teachings, the cleric and champion are obvious choices. Clerics of all 3 traditions are likely present in the faith, but war priest and battle harbingers might be slightly more common due to the importance of armor to the faith. Champions probably most commonly belong to the justice or liberation causes, with the obedience and redemption causes being present as well, but to a lesser degree. Barbarians with the dragon instinct might be drawn to the more militant aspects of Apsu's faith. Monks following Apsu would likely tend toward the dragon-style line of feats. Other martials who follow Apsu likely tend toward medium or heavy armor, indicating that fighters, guardians, and melee rangers might be overrepresented among the faithful. Rangers in particular might excel in the travel aspect of Apsan life. Moving over to the spellcasters, the most common are likely sorcerers with the Draconic bloodline, which has been tremendously expanded in the Draconic Codex. Summoners with the Dragon Eidolon, which will hopefully be retooled in the upcoming Impossible Magic rulebook, would be a good option for devout Apsans as well. Notably, Apsu openly refuses to create oracles. He considers the curses which oracles bear to be unbearable burdens to place upon mortals. That's not to say that no oracles might serve him, only that their curses would not have been bestowed by Apsu himself. The time mystery might be especially thematic. Of the myriad archetypes in the game, the Sentinel might appeal to followers of Apsu, who want to improve their skills with medium or heavy metallic armor. The Chrono Skimmer or Time Mage archetypes might appeal to characters who relate to his aspects as a deity of time, while the Scout or Horizon Walker might appeal to his aspects as a god of travel. And, of course, the Drake Rider and Draconic Acolyte archetypes can immediately connect any character to the idea of dragons. Now, a lot of these mechanical options ask players to choose specific types of dragons with which their character is associated. So, what dragons might be particularly drawn to the faith of Apsu? Recall what I said during Apsu's rundown. Among the divine dragons, Imperial and Executor dragons are the most likely to inherently align with Apsu's teachings, while Oath dragons might deem his church or his champions worthy of an alliance and pledge their fealty. Phase and Sky dragons are well suited to the traveling lifestyle which Apsu encourages, and Time dragons might feel a sense of connection with the Waybringer, who first brought time and change to the universe. Of course, it might be just as compelling to choose an associated dragon for your character which is counter-aligned to Apsu's teachings, so your character can have some built-in internal conflict. In the next section, I'll review a few dragons naturally inclined to ally with Dahak. Followers of Apsu are simultaneously explorers of the world and defenders of the innocent. They witness and appreciate the beauty in nature, and at the same time evaluate the terrain around them to understand how it might be put to use in the fight against evil. They are helpful and even friendly when called upon, but never put down roots in a community. They see evil as something which must be confronted, especially the evils of Dahak. At the same time, they see their lives as inherently meaningful and worth protecting. They won't throw themselves headlong into danger without a plan, unless innocent lives hang in the balance. Though rare on Golarion, devout Apsans are valued allies in the fight against evil, and can be counted on in times of strife. Even when the fighting is over, though, their work remains unfinished, and rare indeed is the Apsan whose hands are idle. For players who might be interested in playing characters who follow Dahak, here are a few useful details. For those using the alignment rules, Dahak is a chaotic evil deity, and accepts followers of only that alignment. His edicts are to kill dragons, to destroy things at your whim, and to study past disasters. Conversely, to spare a foe after you've chosen to kill them, to forgive a slight, or to prevent the destruction of things that cannot be saved are all anathema to Dahak. He provides the harm font to his clerics, and clerics and champions are required to choose unholy sanctification. Dahak has the Dragon, Destruction, Fire, and Zeal domains. His holy symbol is a burning dragon scale, falling from the sky like a meteor. Dahak's sacred colors are red, white, and black, which is entirely unsurprising for an evil deity associated with fire, though 3 colors rather than 2 is certainly uncommon. Many followers might wear clothes which were not originally black or red, but which were stained by either soot or the blood of their enemies. Draconic followers might consider the natural color of their scales to be sacred in its own right. Much like with followers of Apsu, the faithful of Dahak have been known to openly display the holy symbol of their god. Despite Dahak's status as a villainous god, he is, in many parts of the world, not widely recognized, and so his holy symbol rarely attracts negative attention. In areas where the endless destruction is known, however, his followers need to show much more discretion. Dahak has 2 favored weapons, just like his father, though in his case they are the jaw strike and the whip. The whip is well suited to Dahak's cruel teachings, and implies that trip, disarm, or intimidation builds are likely common among Dahak's faithful. His teachings surrounding viciousness, fire, and destruction mean that the flaming, crushing, and frightening property runes might be commonly found among his followers. Other weapons in the flail group, or other natural weapons derived from a character's draconic ancestry or class features, are often favored by followers of Dahak as well. Just like Apsu, Dahak has no listed favored animals. Again, thematic familiars might include the calligraphy wyrm, the fey dragonette, or the house drake, while thematic companions might include the riding dragonette, the riding drake, and the wyrm. Dahak's association with fire, however, opens up a few additional themes to explore. Fire-related familiars, for example, like the various elementals, could be great options for followers of Dahak. Also similar to Apsu, Dahak is a fairly niche deity, and so doesn't have a strong following among any of the core ancestries in the game. Dragon-aligned kobolds, dragonettes, and characters with the dragon-blooded versatile heritage all have increased exposure to the faith of Dahak. Some Nari, elemental scions of fire, and Cambion Nephilim, planar scions from hell, might also be drawn to the endless destruction. Due to Dahak's lingering influence in the Mwangi expanse, a number of ancestries and ethnicities native to that region might have been drawn into his faith, though this would be fairly rare due to the fervor with which the Ekuje elves hunt down Dahak's servants in their homeland. Moving on to classes, clerics of all three doctrines likely serve Dahak with regularity. Champions of Dahak likely follow the desecration or iniquity causes. Dragon or elemental fire instinct barbarians are particularly well suited to the faith of Dahak, and the same could be said for dragon-style monks. The whip is well suited to swashbucklers who focus on either athletics or intimidation, but fighters could make excellent use of such tactics as well. Unlike Apsu, who seems to favor heavier armor, Dahak seems to have no preference for strength over dexterity, opening up a wider variety of options for combat styles. As an outside-the-box idea, a bomber alchemist could work great here too. Looking at spellcasters, the Draconic Sorcerer shines once again, but the Elemental Fire Sorcerer and the Diabolic Sorcerer could work just as well. Similarly, the Dragon Eidolon and Elemental Fire Eidolon could both work for the Summoner. The Flames Mystery Oracle could work very well too, as could the Flame Order Druid or the Fire Kineticist. Looking at archetypes, the Drake Rider and Draconic Acolyte are the standout options once again. The Elementalist could be a good option too, especially if the spellcaster in question chooses to focus on fire spells. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, a few remastered dragons stand out as being particularly vulnerable to Dahak's influence, meaning they might serve as draconic influences for Dahak-aligned PCs. Barrage, Cinder, and to a lesser extent Magma dragons all experience destructive tendencies due to the powerful magics swirling within them, and Dahak's teachings surrounding destruction would certainly provide an outlet for them. The Diabolic Dragon, however, is probably the best choice overall, since it has a connection to fire, hell, and wickedness, three major pillars of Dahak's personality and history. Followers of Dahak, the Endless Destruction, are vicious and cruel. Though capable of tremendous savagery and unrestrained violence, they are known to lie in wait for the opportune moment to strike. When they do unleash their anger, however, they strike fast, hard, and without mercy. They will not bear an insult to themselves or their dark god, and they are quick to seek vengeance for even a perceived slight. They fight with overwhelming force and fury, using whatever dirty trick they can to gain the upper hand. Fire and pain are their favored tools, and those who've encountered the followers of Dahak and survived are few and far between. GM Inspiration. For GMs looking to incorporate Apsu or Dahak and their followers into a campaign, here are some ideas. In a broad sense, GMs should consider that the Draconic gods take an extremely long-term view on the Great Beyond and their schemes within it. Much like mortal dragons, Draconic deities think about the world in grand terms. Even more than other deities, the dragon gods think on the scale of millennia, entire nations and cultures, and even entire planes and planets. For that reason, Apsu and Dahak will only rarely present direct visions or directions to humanoid followers. They are more likely to present direct instructions to true dragons, and so dragons might need to serve as intermediaries between these gods and their humanoid faithful. Luckily, this presents a ton of narrative fun, since meeting a dragon is basically as fun and as interesting as receiving a divine mandate. Dragons might present artifacts from their hordes as rewards to heroes, or might provide ancient wisdom to guide the heroes on their way. Perhaps they could even be the source for mythic power in a campaign which employs the mythic system. That particular idea reminds me of Bahamut handing out the class promotions in Final Fantasy I back in the day. Getting into some more specific ideas for how to involve these deities and their followers in a campaign, I have one specific narrative I suggest considering: the planet Triaxis. Further out in Galarian's star system, past the asteroid belt known as the Diaspora and the undead planet of Eox, lies Triaxis, the planet which astronomers refer to as the Wanderer. Long ago, the humanoid Triaxans lived alongside the Drakes and Dragonkin native to their planet in relative peace. Dragonkin are superficially similar to traditional dragons in appearance, but lack much of a true dragon's innate magical power. Their humanoid level of intelligence sets them apart from Drakes, who are far more animalistic, and they also possess impressive levels of manual dexterity, allowing for tool use and weapons craft despite their impressive size. Dragonkin and Drakes existed in impressive numbers on Triaxis, taking up important ecological roles in the planet's ecosystem. Triaxis itself is unique within its system for its eccentric orbit around Golarian's sun. As it orbits, it moves as close to the sun as Castrovel, then moves back as far as Eox and beyond. This seasonal shift takes place over the course of centuries, and the flora and fauna of the planet have adapted to having winter and summer variants capable of surviving the drastically but steadily shifting climate. At some point in the past, the relative peace on Triaxis was shattered with the arrival of the true dragons. The true dragons arrived without warning or reason, and immediately destabilized Triaxan culture and politics. The most wicked of the dragons, historically the chromatic dragons, immediately set about conquering the lesser beings around them. The more benevolent dragons, historically the metallic dragons, broadly opposed this, but went about their resistance at first in an individualistic manner. The defenders of the Triaxans and their dragonkin were slowly killed off and picked apart by their enemies, until the formation of the now legendary Skyfire Mandate. The Skyfire Mandate was a unified coalition of Triaxans, Drakes, Dragonkin, and the remaining good dragons. They fled from the territories conquered by the villainous dragons, called the Drakelands, and established a front line at an isthmus which connected the continent of the Drakelands to the other landmasses on Triaxis. The isthmus served as a choke point, allowing the Skyfire Mandate to rally their forces and fortify their position. Many of the remaining good dragons sacrificed themselves to buy the Mandate time to set up their defensive lines, leaving their Skyfire forces with even fewer draconic patrons. Their efforts, however, succeeded, and the Skyfire Mandate managed to stop the expansion of the Drakelands. Now in the modern day, this stalemate has existed for centuries. The forces of the Skyfire Mandate are loosely organized into largely independent warrior orders, who collaborate under the direction of the Tribunal, a council of 13 generals. These military orders are generally referred to as the Dragon Legion, an alliance of humanoid Triaxans and Dragonkin. While these ancestries might individually lack the power to face off against the true dragons of the Drakelands, they've innovated unique tactics to compensate. The Dragon Legion is best known for its battalions of Dragon Riders, humanoid Triaxans who ride armed and armored Dragonkin into battle. The Dragonkin handle large-scale melee combat, wielding enormous lances, axes, and swords, while the Triaxans support them with archery and spellcraft. These warrior pairs are tremendously effective in combat, and are more than capable of holding the Drakelands forces at bay. Within the Dragon Legion and the Skyfire Mandate more broadly, the faith of Apsu is particularly prominent. Though many of the other elder deities, like Pharasma and Desna, are acknowledged and widely worshipped on Triaxis, Apsu holds a place of prominence. Some legions in the Skyfire Mandate even have the goal of raising a vast army of draconic warriors, who they can transport to Golarion on the day of the final battle with Dahak. On the other side of the conflict, the Drakelands are not nearly as unified or cohesive. The Drakelands are subdivided into a collection of broken-up kingdoms, each of which is ruled over by a true dragon. The vast majority of these true dragons rule as tyrannical despots, but the nature of their governments varies. Some of these nations are formal kingdoms, with complex economies and political bureaucracies over which the Dragon King presides. Other nations are little more than feudal states, with the draconic monarch ruling over a peasant class of humanoids and extracting taxes under threat of force. Within all these nations, however, there exists a generally consistent racial hierarchy. True dragons reign supreme within the Drakelands, as nothing can rival their power. Beneath them are the Dragonkind, who make up much of the bureaucracy and fill the roles of executors of state power. Beneath them are the dragon-blooded humans, those infused with a small degree of draconic power based on their ancestral heritage. At the bottom of the structure are the humanoid Triaxans, who carry out most of the labor, and can generally be thought of as a slave class. Within the Drakelands, a few small states are ruled by non-evil true dragons, who often work together to stay afloat among their more aggressive and corrupt neighbors. These statelets are few and far between, however, and make no open allegiance with the Skyfire Mandate. The faith of Dahak seems to be practiced somewhat consistently in the Drakelands, and it is far more prominent there than it is on Golarion. It seems likely that the true dragons of Triaxis have the same strained relationship with the Sorrowmaker as their Golarion-based cousins. That said, the sheer number of dragons, dragonkin, and drakes, as well as dragon-blooded humanoids on Triaxis, means that even Dahak's faith has legions of potential devotees to draw from. Much as Apsu holds sway over the dragon legions of the Skyfire Mandate, Dahak holds sway over the disorganized armies of the Drakelands. Triaxis presents an absolutely fantastic setting for GMs and players to explore, and I really look forward to seeing it examined in future books. We have a solid start in Book 4 of the Reign of Winter adventure path, and Starfinder will certainly present a far future look at what's going on there. That said, I would really like to see a planetary book as we continue to flesh out the Lost Omens setting throughout this edition of the game, just to see what has changed with the major changes to dragons since the remaster. Sources and additional reading. For those of you who want to do further reading on the topic of Apsu and Dahak, there's a ton of printed material to choose from. The single most important source for up-to-date information is, obviously, the Draconic Codex, one of the best Pathfinder books Paizo has released in years. Divine Mysteries is less up-to-date and less comprehensive, but does provide some current mechanical information on Dahak and Apsu. For a deeper dive into the aesthetic and day-to-day details of these faiths, the Inner Sea Faiths book from 1E is the best possible source of inspiration. Lastly, the Pathfinder Adventure Path Age of Ashes is a fantastic exploration of the machinations of Dahak and his followers, though it is technically a pre-remastered document, so some of that information, especially the references to metallic and chromatic dragons, is outdated. Several secondary sources are great if you want to examine some of the more niche aspects of Apsu and Dahak's history. The Travel Guide, for instance, presents one of the alternative takes on the Draconic mythology. The Mwangi Expanse book offers a fantastic look at the culture of the Ekuje Elves, a people with a deep ancestral connection to Dahak. And War of Immortals provides an excellent look at the effects of the God's reign on the Cold War between Apsu and Dahak. A few other sources are useful when examining the past of the Draconic Pantheon and its followers. Rise of the Rune Lords Book 4, Fortress of the Stone Giants, presents an incredibly deep dive into early Draconic lore, including creation myths and the divisions between chromatic and metallic dragons. Book 4 of the Reign of Winter AP takes a similarly deep dive into the planet Triaxis and the faiths of Apsu and Dahak within that culture. The Pathfinder Chronicles books Dragons Revisited and Gods and Magic both look at the early interpretations of the Draconic creation myth. The same can be said for the Pathfinder Player Companion books Faiths of Corruption and Faiths of Purity, and the campaign setting books Inner Sea Gods and the Inner Sea World Guide. Finally, the campaign setting book Artifacts and Legends takes a very close look at the orbs of Dragonkind, including their origins, their methods of destruction, and the various lesser forms which exist. These artifacts will likely never be covered by Paizo again due to their prominence within D&D, so GMs could certainly go nuts with them and take them in some new and exciting directions without worrying about future retcons. Well, that's it. That's Apsu and Dahak, the father-son pair of the Draconic deities who've existed since the very beginning of the Pathfinder system. While many deities have been reinterpreted over Paizo's publication history, Apsu and Dahak have received some of the most significant rewrites, and it's fascinating to see what the writing team has come up with over the years to fit these characters to the needs of the broader Pathfinder narrative. While the Waybringer and the Endless Destruction are certainly the most famous and popular of the Draconic deities, and were the only known members of that ancestral pantheon for a long time, the Draconic Codex has presented 7 new deities which PCs might choose to worship. In my next video, I'm going to examine each of those 7 deities in greater detail, picking apart the limited lore that we have to present players with inspiration for PCs who follow each of those Draconic gods. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.